School of Music, and for some reason I'm the Director of Mindfulness in the Arts for the Center for Mindfulness Science as well, even though I'm not a scientist. It was a dream of mine to one day have a research study in mindfulness practice and musicians' performance anxiety. And in researching that, one of my colleagues highly recommended that I search out the work of Dr. Frank Ruiz. And
Diaz. That's okay.
I'm sorry.
That's all right.
I had a student years ago named Frank Ruiz, and for some reason I made that
It's better than
mistake.
Diaz.
Oh,
That's all right.
The thing is, no one's ever gotten my last name wrong. Anyway, sorry about that.
Oh, that's
Obviously not being very mindful. In talking with him, it suddenly occurred that it would be so fantastic to get him here in person. And the Center for Mindfulness Science has put on this keynote address, but we're keeping him very busy. He just had a meeting with students from the music teaching and learning program here at USC, because he's a professor, an associate professor of music education. He's a conductor. He's a noted researcher in contemplative practice, co-founder of the Music and Mind Institute.
Music in my lab.
Okay, I'm not getting my facts right.
That's okay.
Also through the Wellness Committee, tonight at 7 o'clock, he's going to be doing a joint discussion on musical mindfulness with one of our faculty members, Richard Wolff, who wrote a book about the bridge between music and mindfulness called In Tune. And in a nutshell, today is really more of the scientific approach. The event tonight at 7 o'clock is more of a practicum approach for general music students who want to know more about the intersection between music and mindfulness. But we are really, really pleased to have him here. Please welcome Frank.
Yes. Happy to be here. Thank you. Thanks for the sunshine. I'm going to start with that. Coming from Indiana and being a Miami boy, I'm really enjoying blue skies and sunshine for a few days. So there will be no seasonal affective disorder affecting my talk today. I'd like to get a sense of who's in the audience before I start. It helps me gear things maybe slightly different. How many of you are from the music school? Okay. How many of you are psychologists or some kind of neuroscience folks? Okay, a handful of you. Social scientists. Okay. Generally curious. Okay, great. Okay, so I'll do my best to sort of make this as open-ended and as applicable as I can, but hopefully we'll get through this. I'm going to talk today about musicians' mindfulness from the inside out. I'm going to draw on the work of Chilean biologist Francisco Varela, who prematurely died. Does anyone maturely die? I always ask myself that question. I think died too young. He was developing a research program called Neurophenomenology. If you were here a couple months ago with Cliff Sarin speaking, I'm sure you heard some of this. Some of this will be variations on Cliff's themes. I was inspired by Cliff's writings on this, along with Amishi Jha and Antoine Lutz and other, Evan Thompson, and other folks who do a little bit of blend of cognitive science, philosophy, psychology, and neuroscience. And the fundamental question, or the thing that I want to talk about today, is how do we get to understanding what musicians need or want or can benefit from in mindfulness? And so the question is contextual. The field of mindfulness right now is burgeoning, it's broad, it's open. There's a lot of things that are being talked about. One thing that becomes really interesting to me is when we talk about mindfulness and use what the measures that we typically use in the sciences, in the social sciences as well, we're making assumptions about very broad populations. And I want to talk a little bit about more specific populations. I want to talk about musicians and also draw a tiny bit on the work of what's going on in sports psychology, which I think is where mindfulness is going to end up. It's going to end up looking like this for musicians. And most importantly is how do we get a research protocol that gets into the experience of a musician that also can look at the scientific aspect of it. So that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to start with just a little bit of background here. I can list up numerous studies, but there's a recent meta-analysis by Lipson and his colleagues in 2016 that points to the fact that students in music, visual arts, and architecture are more susceptible to depression, suicidal ideations, and anxiety. It appears this is the first time someone's done some kind deep methodological sort of study on what's going on in that world, and this is something that we've sensed for a long time. These are folks who are in high stress, high performance, high visibility, social contexts that are performing for people and are being judged. And so we know there's a prevalence of it, so there's an aspect of this that is, of course, wellness. How do we make musicians more well? We know also that some of my research has looked more specifically at what it is that musicians experience. And one of the findings, some of the preliminary findings, just looking at collegiate level musicians, is that we're fairly certain that they have high levels of socially prescribed perfectionism. So, of course, if you're a musician, you might be a perfectionist, you might have perfectionist cognitions. There's a scale, a Hewitt-Fleck, which has several types of perfectionism that is measured. One is social, our sense of being judged by other people, and one of it is self, and the other one is other-directed, which is my favorite because it correlates with narcissism. So if you judge other people highly and are perfectionist about them, but not about you, you tend to be okay. So, and that skill correlates with narcissism. So I could end the talk by saying, don't use mindfulness, just become a narcissist and you're going to be okay. But I won't say that today. And there's quite a bit of research. I just listed one study that I just referenced recently on intense physical activity among athletes may be increasing anxiety and depression. And so we don't know yet, although we could know, who knows, this research moves really quickly. We don't know exactly what it is about athletes that causes them. I mean, they have the same sort of rate of anxiety and depression as the general population, but among elite athletes, you start to see quite a bit of a difference. So some of that we believe has to do with the fact that they're being pushed beyond their limits, and that they don't have psychological and physical coping tools to self-regulate some of the things that are happening to them as they become elite athletes. So why do I bring athletes up here? Because again, I think you can compare musicians to athletes in a lot of different ways. They both have highly skilled performance expectations. They have fine motor control development that they have to adhere to. They are in public spaces being judged. There's a lot of similarities. So to look at this, it might be interesting to do cross comparisons between the two disciplines. And then there's a picture of somebody swimming in a horn player. Anybody play horn in here? Yeah, so horn players are particularly paranoid. They have to play into a tiny little mouthpiece, and if they just miss by like a quarter inch, the tone or the pitch goes in a different direction. Okay, so what do we know about mindfulness and music and sport? In other words, we know there's a problem, so what do we know? We know that, for example, if someone, this is a semi-qualitative study, that with singers in Europe, someone put them through an 8-week mindfulness type course, very similar to mindfulness-based stress reduction, MBSR, and they had some outcomes. They felt like, this is self-report, they felt like they felt better physically, cognitively, they reported feeling more focused, they felt more artistic, and they felt their interpersonal skills had improved. And I think that's pretty much in line with what you would find with regards to mindfulness in sort of general populations. So people feel better connected to other folks depending upon the types of practices that they do. So again, consistent, but this was not necessarily a scientific sample. In mine, what I found out is that people who meditate, not specifically mindfulness, there was no differentiation between mindfulness practice and, say, yoga or other contemplative practices, that folks who meditate at least once a week for at least 15 minutes, if you want to talk about a dose, and if we did this for 6 weeks, tend to report lower performance anxiety overall. And we also find that if they are in their trait mindfulness, if their natural proclivity to be mindful is high, it inversely correlates with trait anxiety. So that was interesting. Of course, that's not causal. We can't tell whether the meditation practices that they reported actually made them more mindful. When we did look at that variable, we didn't have really enough data. We sort of prematurely concluded that maybe a little bit of practice might help, but we couldn't conclusively say that mindfulness made a difference. So there's something there. Our latest study, which I will talk about today, we did find that among a group of 18 students that mindfulness helped reduce their anxiety and rumination, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then in sports, Gardner and Moore just did a really, really big overview of several studies, again, another meta-analysis, that looked at mindfulness, and what they found is several kinds of mindfulness programs being used in sports generally improve both the well-being of athletes and also their performance, right? And I think it's really interesting to differentiate between these two. In music, for example, my population might not be as interested in being happier or more well. They might just be interested in being better performers. We also have folks who are not so interested in mindfulness because of that. They're interested in just being happier people in general, right? And so this is a distinction I think that needs to be made in the literature and the protocols that we look at. What are we doing this for? Okay, so here's the elephant in the room. What the heck is mindfulness? So if I ask that question to each of you, and if you're interested in this field, we're going to come up with a lot of different definitions of what mindfulness is. I think this is an artifact of the process in which mindfulness made itself into cultural consciousness in the United States. If you recall, John Kabat-Zinn, 1979, opens up the Massachusetts Stress Clinic, teaches meditation to patients who have chronic pain, does not want to use the word meditation, so he uses the word mindfulness as an umbrella term to cover multiple practices, right? That's really important because I think at that time, culturally, that's what made sense. What that has done, however, is, in terms of research, is that it has made it almost impossible to operationally define what we mean by mindfulness. Because this all started as what? A Buddhist practice. And so that's another controversial opinion that I'm going to stand on. Whether we agree that mindfulness is Buddhist or not, or that it does need to be Buddhist, it was primarily cultivated within Buddhist religious contexts over 2,500 years ago. And so I do believe you can separate the psychological process involved in mindfulness from this, but I think it's very difficult for us to make the leap into a completely ethically decontextualized practice that somehow serves well-being. I'll get more into that later. I have some data. So what do we know? We think mindfulness might be a state that's amenable to training. That's good. Otherwise, why are we teaching people mindfulness? One of the weird things in the literature is to see someone take a trait mindfulness measure, and they say, oh, look at this person has higher trait mindfulness, and they're involved with X, Y, and Z. And then they use that to justify why you should train people in mindfulness. So you see the problem there. If it's a trait, then why are we training it? What is the relationship between those two? And as a matter of fact, some of the scales have shown, have not been able to discriminate between, for example, trait mindfulness based on meditation and trait mindfulness based on lots of drinking. So, you know, if as a control group, if you drank a lot, your trait mindfulness was higher. So we have an operational definition problem here, I think, when we can't discriminate these things. So it's a state that might be amenable to training. I think that's what most of us hope it is, especially people like me that teach mindfulness. MBSR and the various programs that are available for general health and psychotherapy are what we call soteriological paths. So in other words, these are paths that have to do with salvation. This is a religious word, right? Saving ourselves from what? Well, remember that this is a Buddhist practice, so what were Buddhists mainly concerned with? The relief of suffering. The reduction of suffering as part of the human condition was where this was originally cultivated as a practice in that context. And so those are implied in MBSR, but the problem with that, of course, you may have heard before, is that if I give people multiple practices and have them do it over 8 weeks, and then at the end I take some measures, I have no way of telling you which one of those practices actually affected what these individuals experience at the end. I can't draw a causal link between 20 practices that can't be separated and some kind of outcome. So trying to define what is a mindfulness practice is really critical. And of course, I talked about the psychological trait. Let's also talk about styles of practice. Look over here. Some of you are familiar with new taxonomies of mindfulness. We know, for example, that there's a focused breath meditation where you hold the breath as an object of awareness, and that's sort of the main part of the protocol. There's also body scans, which aren't necessarily that. They're a sort of meta-awareness scanning of your physical body, so your focal point changes. That might have different outcomes. It might take advantage of different networks that we could look at. There's sitting meditation. There's sensory awareness meditation. There's self-compassion. There's visualization. I can go on and on and on. So when we say mindfulness causes X, or mindfulness is related to X, my question is, which one of these did you use? Which networks are these practices targeting? What experiences is this targeting? And an even more important question is, do I have to do all of these? Maybe my problem is I can't focus. Do I really need a compassion practice to help me focus? So when we're diagnosing, if that's such a term, we're asking people to do a mindfulness practice, It would be like me learning, I always say I'm a bassist. I'm a jazz bassist primarily, and an orchestral conductor. So, what are the specific fundamental skills that I need to learn in order to do my job really well? Well, playing piano might help. It might maybe take advantage of similar networks, but it's not going to help me as much as actually playing scales on the bass. So learning to contextualize this, I think, is a critical aspect of this research. All right. So I come from the humanities, right? I'm a music guy, I'm a teacher, so I'm sorry if you're like a hardcore scientist who used to a lot of data. I like videos and pretty things. So I'm going to show you a video of the operational definition problem with mindfulness, but from little kids in the UK who are doing mindfulness in the schools, and they ask them, what is mindfulness? And I think they have the same problems we have. So I'll just show you what this kid has to say. I think they're very wise.
The whole point of mindfulness is where you calm down and relax.
Calm down and relax.
And then mindfulness is where we have to calm down after playtime and get back into learning. It makes me breathe out all of the things that I had to worry about by using our senses and work together.
Basically, it's like all of those feelings going into our body and into our mind. So your mind gets all shook up, it's not clear, and you can't think clearly.
I like where we go around the circle, telling everyone what we feel like in colours, types of weather, or normal feelings. I feel sunny, or I feel rainbow. We go in bubbles and we breathe in and out, which calms us down. Really think about your thoughts. Otherwise, I would be excited and wouldn't be able to do my work. I think the point of it is because,
That kid's got it down. So if you look at what just happened there, right? These poor teachers are given like a 2-day workshop on mindfulness. There's this ancient contemplative practice. But we're going to teach you how to do this in a few minutes, and then we're going to give you some cards, and then you're going to do it. You don't need to practice it, by the way. You just need to teach people how to do it because it's this cute little thing. And then watch what happens to the children. And there you go. That's what happens to the children. They have no idea what they're doing. Actually, if you listen to what they're saying, as we do, they confuse outcomes with processes, they're all over the place, right? And you would think as rational adults doing science, we wouldn't do the same thing, but in essence we are. We often don't have good operational definitions and are not separating actually doing a practice from its particular outcome. So one of the arguments I'll make today during this talk is that you can use mindfulness for a lot of different things, but people who don't know why they're using it might not get the outcomes that we think they're supposed to get. So in other words, if I'm doing mindfulness but I have no idea why, at the end I can give you some general report of what might have happened, but go back to the drinking study. I may just be having more scotch, right? And so how to differentiate those two things is really critical. Okay, and by the way, I don't say this to criticize anybody. I am guilty of this. My first few studies were, I think, abject failures. And part of the reason is I don't really know what I was looking at. I didn't know what my dependent measure was, and I was looking for it. And through not having some correspondence between what my subjects were experiencing and what I was measuring, I've come to think about this a little differently. All right, let's go. So I'm not the only one talking about this. Richard Davidson and Al Kazniak, if you don't know who Richard Davidson is, he wrote Altered Traits, recent book, really great book on the neuroscience of mindfulness. And Al Kazniak, who was at University of Arizona, is now emeritus, who is a Zen practitioner and also a neuroscientist and psychologist. And they wrote a paper, I think it might be close to 10 years now, talking about conceptual methodological issues in research on mindfulness, sort of giving out the warning, hey, we have to be careful about what we're talking about here. And then Jasana Dorji, who is also a practitioner, recently wrote, I think this is might be 2014, I can't remember the exact date. Oh, wait, no, it's not 2016. Is talking about defining contemplative science, what we're doing here, and also the context of meditation. In other words, is mindfulness the same thing if I'm an athlete? Am I using it the same way as I would be if I'm a musician? And what are the differences? And of course, what Dorji is talking about is that we can't take an outcome out of its context. We can't just say these people experience this as if it is indeed something they didn't want to experience. So she's framing this into a sort of Buddhist context, that this started as a contemplative practice that was based on the idea that you could reduce suffering by seeing your consciousness, your reality, your body, your senses, your way of relating to the world in a very different way than what was habitually done at that time. So these are deep questions. So what does that mean? I think practically is when we say mindfulness, what practice are you talking about? We need to define that. How long do people practice? Right? So if we have people practice for 5 minutes, as we do in education, what are we expecting? And I'll see people at the education school where I work say, mindfulness increases concentration. Well, how do you know? Well, I read a study. Well, how do you know about it? Well, how long did they do the intervention? Well, these are Buddhist monks that have meditated for 10,000 hours. Okay, Kippy in your 3rd grade art classroom is not going to meditate for 10,000 hours. So we have to be careful about dosage here and how long it takes to actually create these putative neurological changes in the brain that we believe are going on. What did the person experience? I've been teaching mindfulness and contemplative practices as both a musician and also in a religious setting for over 15 years, and I can tell you that when I ask people, what did you experience? It never happens the way that we think it's supposed to happen based on the script. We get a wide range of experiences, including some negative ones, which have been in the press lately. If you meditate for long enough, you might have some negative psychological experiences. Why is that? What are we doing here? Who designed the protocol? So I think as a musician, I often read performance science studies. This is not a criticism of anybody here. I'll read a performance science study and I'll say, that person was probably a musician because they designed a protocol that at least had some semblance to what we might actually do as musicians. So the idea of context. Who is the person designing the protocol? If I have no understanding of the context in which this arises, what am I designing? Right? I should not design a sports protocol for mindfulness. I should consult with people who are athletes and say, what do you guys do? What do you need? How do you think about this before I design some kind of intervention? So this is what they're calling, who designed this? Axiology, what do these people want? In MBSR, you always start by asking the participant, what do you hope to get out of this? What do you hope concentrating more will do? What do you hope letting go of your thoughts will do for you? And rarely does, no one says, well, I'm really hoping that my executive network really strengthens after 15 weeks of meditation. We don't get those kind of answers. We get answers that are contextual. It's like, I want to be nicer to my wife because I don't pay attention to her. Okay, so again, the science side of that would say, well, that doesn't matter when we see what happens from a third-person perspective, and I'm caricaturing. I realize that people are more complex than this, right? But we have to take experience seriously. And then, is it transferring to everyday life? If I teach a student how to meditate at the Jacobs School of Music and they're a high-level performer, they might be doing that in my class, they might be doing it under my supervision, but is it going to help them at all when they stand in front of a group and have to play, when they conduct? What is happening? How is this transferring over, and are people actually understanding it? So that's the world that what I'm going to propose to you is that there might be a solution for this. Okay, so anybody know, a neuroscientist might know, what's going on here? What happened 10 minutes after meditation? Left, I believe, is pre-meditation, right is post-meditation. What happened? Anybody want to gander? I know you didn't expect to have a discussion, but what's going on there?
His brain turned into yin and yang.
Yeah. Context matters, right? Something changed, didn't it? We see different, maybe particular parts of the brain activating in a different way, right? We see that there's a change there. Okay, great. And I think a lot of times people will put brains up and say, and people in education do this a lot, there's a lot of sort of pseudo-neuroscience understanding. They'll say, look, the brain changed when you meditated. And I'll say, well, it also changes when you rake your leaves. It also changes when you do anything at all, because all experience is mediated by the brain, so of course it's changing. And I think what they mean is something significant happened that's going to change a trait, right? But we don't get to that. So I can't tell you what this human being is experiencing by looking at that. All I can tell you is there's a correlate to their experience based on what I believe I may have done as an intervention. And although this answers a very important, perhaps important neurobiological question, it doesn't answer the question of does this matter to the practitioner on some level? And I'm going to make the argument that it should. So neurophenomenology, I want to get a little bit into this. Francisco Varela started this sort of protocol from a different perspective. So Francisco is a Chilean biologist. He was also a meditation practitioner. And in the 1990s, the issue of consciousness sort of became a hot topic in philosophy of mind and debates. And many of us know these debates, so we've talked about them, or at least we adhere to one particular idea of what consciousness might be. And you might be familiar with the name David Chalmers. Anybody familiar with that name? He wrote a really interesting book about consciousness being, he's a panpsychic, so he basically believes that everything has to be conscious. That's how you solve the hard problem of consciousness. Everything in the universe has sentience, including an atom. And so there was a lot of speculation about what consciousness was. I am not going to get into that today. I have my own ideas about what this is. But I will say that what Varela said was, you know what, I don't know if we're going to be able to solve that problem using the methods we have now, but here's a problem we can solve. We can look at experience, and we can look at science and sort of outside observation and find a way for these two to mutually constrain each other. In other words, is what we're looking at the brain, does it correspond to experience? Not at some abstract level, but on a deep level. And what this requires is phenomenology, which is a discipline associated with Edmund Husserl and Merleau-Ponty, having to do with disciplined introspection. So I want to make that really clear. When I say lived experience or phenomenology, most people think self-report. That's not what we're talking about here, although that's an aspect of it. We're talking about the ability to look at your experience in a very trained way and allow certain things to be bracketed and suspended so that theoretically you can see experience in a rawer form, in what's happening, getting beneath experience. By the way, this is what mindfulness is doing. I just have to say, what you're doing in mindfulness is you're not so interested in the objects of your experience, but in the processes behind them. Are you focusing? Are you allowing thoughts to let go? Are you aware of what's going on and holding it in a non-judgmental space? So there are overlaps between phenomenology and mindfulness that I think are critical. But I'll give you a little experiment. I love this. This is an easy way to explain, I think, what Francisco is doing. This is a study by Rodriguez et al. It's 1999. It's using EEG. And what happened here is they were asking people to look at a Mooney face. If you know, how many of you know what a Mooney face is? It's essentially a face that it takes you a minute to sort of make meaning out of. So it's just ambiguous enough. Your brain has to kick in and go. So it's not perceptual. It's more of a cognitive processing. Oh, I'm looking at that and it's a face. So if you look up here, if you look long enough, you might see a face. Okay? So what they did in this particular study is that they asked people to, they trained them a little bit in noticing their experience so they could report what was going on while they had EEG. I'm always a little skeptical of how much signal and noise ratio there was in that because I've used EEG imaging and if you blink, getting a blink out of an EEG is a difficult thing. Probably not so difficult anymore, but at this point it was very difficult to do that. And here's what they found out. So if you look, just to get beneath this a little bit, when there was perception, there was about 360 milliseconds after a human being gave a phenomenologically rich description of, oh, that's a face. There was quite a bit of neural integration. In other words, there was quite a bit of connectivity that was going on across the brain, and then there was phase scattering. So phase locking and phase scattering. What does this have to do with what we're talking about today? I think what neurophenomenology was getting at was, if we just look at when a person perceives something, we're not getting a really good detail of what it was they were experiencing because there's such a difference in a neurally organized experience of the world that has meaning. In other words, when we make sense of things, versus just a perception of something. And of course, this is old news now. This is a debate that's been going on for a long time. It's not new, but it was fairly new in terms of how to look at it. So what Varela says is, first of all, you ask people when they experience something. You teach them to report in a much richer way. Then you look at the data. This is what we call third-person data. And what Varela meant by third-person data was more than just brains. He actually thought anything that was observable from a third-person perspective and could be quantified. So that included any embodied practices, cultural practices. I think psychometrics fits really well into there where we're quantifying specific things. And then, this is interesting, expert in contextual mediation. So this is the idea of who's asking the question and what is this protocol about, right? A transfer to here is, if you've never meditated, should you design a meditation study? It's an open question. I have an opinion. Or should I at least get somebody in my group that has meditated before so that they develop a protocol that actually makes sense? This is just some early stuff, very interesting, nice evidence that at least neural integration here seemed to be what was an interesting neural marker of actual consciousness, the way that we understand it as meaning making. Okay, boy, I dropped this bomb a week ago and I hope it doesn't go anywhere here, but Varela was answering. He was talking about consciousness. I wanted to sort of bring this out. On the right-hand side, I think this is where most people are in the profession that I speak to. The sort of, you can reduce consciousness to neurons and brain function in biology. And he kind of takes it across all the way up to here to our friend Daniel Dennett, who says, who cares? The only way you can look at consciousness is as something functional, right? So I'm not sure what the relationship is here, but he'll say it's an illusion. And then you get all the way here, some of my favorites, the Mysterians. Nagel wrote a really interesting article called What It's Like to Be a Bat, where he makes the point that how do you know what it's like to be a bat? You can look at a bat's brain, you can look at its neural activity, you can look, but there's no way you will ever know what it's like to be a bat because what? Experience cannot be reduced to observation from the outside. Experience is what? Irreducible. The phenomenologists are a little different. This is Chalmers, Flanagan, Mykoff Johnson, of course Varela. And what they were saying is, okay, but you can still observe experience. You can still classify what's going on. And they called this phenomenal invariance. And I want to pause on that for a second. Phenomenal invariance don't have to do necessarily with the objects of perception, but in the processes that are involved in perception. So for example, attention. If I were to ask you to tell me what your level of attention is, or your level of focus, most of us would understand that regardless of the object we're attending to. So I could say on a scale from 1 to 10, how focused are you on this object? You can self-report that. We might ask you, as you're engaged in a particular process, how easy is it for you to let go of ruminating thoughts? You might be able to report that. What they were looking for was phenomenal invariance that were between and within subjects so we can develop a science or method of introspection that could be tied to scientific outcomes. And I'll get a little bit more into that later. This is the Thompson's configuration of this. We're looking for phenomenal invariance. Remember, we're not looking for lived experience as it is. It's not so much I saw a cat, but what was my relationship with that cat? How do I experience that cat? What was my attention like? What were my feelings about it, right? Getting into other things about it. I'll skip formal dynamical models here. This is sort of the intro, how we're contextualizing things. And then here are somatic and neural processes, but I think you can add other things like quantitative self-report. I might stretch that. I don't know if Evan Thompson would agree with me, but I think you can do some of that there. Okay, so I want you to read that for a moment, and I'm going to get into my study. Interesting. This is a first-person account of a group of undergraduate students at the Jacobs School of Music, which volunteered to be in a mindfulness study as part of a class project. They wanted to be involved in a 5-day sort of module that we were going to use also to take data. And one of the things we asked them right from the start is, what are you experiencing? And there's a couple things I want to point out here. So we see the word anxiety. We see the context of that anxiety. It's because of lessons, so we know there's a trigger there, maybe. I have nagging thoughts in my head, so if I wanted to translate that, I might say there's some rumination going on in that student. It's causing them distress. There's also a little bit of social anxiety, right? And then I'm not moving anywhere, so self-efficacy decreases, which then affects the concentration. Okay, that's complicated. There's a lot there, and if we're not careful, we can just say, well, why don't you just do this nice breath awareness practice to help with your anxiety, without looking at the full human being and on all the things that are in there. By the way, some of the things I just point out might be candidates for what we call phenomenal invariance. Can we look at these things and say, is there a way to code this across people where it isn't just about the things going on in their lives, but about processing, cognitive processes? So I want to contrast this with this student. On the surface, they might seem very similar in that they're both in what? Distress, they're both suffering. But if you look a little deeper and if you work with humanists and you work with people who are really good at interpreting sort of lived experience and verbalizations of that, you might find that there's actually something different between these two students and the way that they are suffering. So how do we get to the problem of these two students might be different, and I might want to recommend different practices for these students. I might also want to find out how long have they been practicing. And do I want to give them a 20-minute body scan if they can't sit still for 3 minutes? Do I want to give them something from an app that isn't targeting anything specifically? So phenomenology helps us to look at experiences like this and in a way sort them, classify them, think about them in ways that might make sense across individuals as sort of common processes. So I wanted to take this a little further with musicians based on the recommendations of Davidson and Kosniak and Lutz and other researchers who said, okay, here's some things we need to know. We need to know what different practice styles and their durations, how that affects anybody, but in this case, musicians. They have a more comprehensive definition of mindfulness, which I'll get to in a minute. Am I accounting for their experience and context, values, desired outcomes? Who's designing this intervention? Do I have first and third person data? Is it ecologically valid? In other words, is this stuff they would actually do? Sometimes when we're in an experimental setting, we ask people to do mindfulness, we forget that they're in an experimental setting. As a Buddhist practitioner, meditation practitioner, it would be very difficult I could do that in an MRI. I could do it with an EEG headset. It's very different than when I do it inside a temple or when I do it in another context in which the aesthetics of the room and the context help mediate what I'm experiencing. So removing that is very difficult to contend with. And finally, does it transfer? So I am not a neuroscientist. I have training in cognitive psychology and education and in some of these things. So I want to start by saying off the bat that what I took from this was this call by Antoine Lutz and others to say we need phenomenological data first. We need to figure out what do novices experience through meditation so we can build a framework that says these are phenomena we might want to investigate from a first and third person experience. So I'll talk about the protocol, what we did, but at the end I have to contextualize it. I didn't put any machines on anyone, okay? And nor am I qualified to do that. I would use a neuroscientist or somebody with that kind of training to do this with me, if there's any volunteers. This is probably again, Sarah was here a couple months ago investigating the phenomenological matrix of mindfulness-related practices from a neurocognitive perspective. Came out in American Psychologist in 2015. What they proposed a set of phenomenal invariants. They said these are things that most people can report on, they can be trained on, and that have what? Neural correlates that have already been established, or at least that we think might be established. So I use this as a model, and here's here's how they describe it. They describe mindfulness as a family of practices that target aspects of experience. So in other words, looking at all those things, what are the targets of mindfulness? What can we target? They make an argument later that you target particular processes, and we'll talk about those. What are the categories that are targeted, right? And can we get them from both secular and contemplative frameworks? So for example, maybe Buddhists might meditate on they might have open awareness so that they can see the nature of emptiness, okay? But that might not be a transferable concept for a musician. Maybe you engage in open awareness so you can see the field of thought and experience that may be getting in the way of producing a particular outcome. So both processes would require something we might label as meta-awareness, which might have a neural correlate, but the contexts are very different. Well, if we're going to look at this, they have to be trained, they have to be able to be manipulated, these mental processes, and they have to be reported, otherwise we're kind of out of luck, right? And then this might differentiate between styles of practice and expertise, what might work for a novice versus an experienced person. And then of course, can we report this in a way that's compatible with the psychological and brain sciences, right? When we're talking that language, I think we have to be careful that we're talking about things that scientists understand, especially if we're going to make a case about using mindfulness in public schools, not using bad science and bad data to explain what these potential outcomes are. Let's go through these real quick. Really, hopefully, I'm spend too. These are the 7 dimensions that Lutz and colleagues came up with. The first one is object orientation. So this is easy. You can either attend to an object or the object chooses you. So all of us can say, oh yeah, I'm purposely attending to my finger. It's visual attention, it's directed. As soon as you start to go away from the finger because you're drawn off, that something else is choosing your attention. So this is sort of a top-down, bottom-up process that we can talk about. Most people can report on that. De-reification comes from, I think this term can also be decentering. There's a lot of different ways to talk about this. And essentially, this is the idea that when there's a mental process, people who have problems de-reifying will believe that that mental process is real. It's actually occurring in that moment. So people with rumination, issues with rumination or trauma might have a thought, and they will believe that thought to the point that they have a physiological experience that takes them back to what that experience was before. They're not able, they fuse with the object, which is very difficult to get rid of if you're not working in some way purposely to work with that particular phenomenon. Meta-awareness is easy. This is us monitoring experience. You're doing it right now, or you're not. If you drifted away during this talk, congratulations, you're human. You may have gone off to chocolate in your head, or maybe a drink, or what you're doing afterwards. That's daydreaming. That selected you. And the minute you kick in meta-awareness, it does what? It disengages from daydreaming and brings you back into the room. So sometimes just being meta-aware, just noticing your experiences, will keep you actively engaged with whatever's going on in front of you. So people can report that. These are the primary qualities. Almost every mindfulness practice that you do will have these three components, either implicitly or explicitly stated in the directions. Sometimes it's implicit, so it requires that you do this whether you're actively doing it or not. So for example, for me to maintain object orientation, because I'm human, I'm going to have to de-reify. If I want to maintain my attention on an object and something comes into my head that troubles me, I have to be able to what? Let it go. If I can't let it go, I can't actually maintain object orientation. But someone might not say to me, they're not necessarily going to say, Frank, notice what's coming up in your mind and let it go. They might just say, bring your attention to the present moment and to your senses. Okay? So they're giving me an object, in this case a physical object. These are secondary qualities. How big is the aperture? So in focused attention practices, my breath is a very narrow aperture. But in open awareness practices, the aperture is massive, which is very difficult for people to do. It's everything comes in. We just don't attach to anything. As a Zen practitioner, this is my practice. We call it shikantaza. You sit and you don't attach to anything that comes up. You just notice it. You kind of just see it coming in. That's really difficult to do as a practice. And so one thing that we're getting out of this is, what practice do we introduce first? Object orientation seems like a good place to start. And actually that case is made in altered traits as well, and in terms of how you might want to sequence meditation practices. Clarity, okay, so if I focus on something like in a state of flow, the vividness of that experience might be incredibly bright and rich. In visualization practices, like compassion practices, if you talk to Tibetan monks, they will tell you, oh, I'm visualizing this particular human being as a deity, I'm visualizing Tara, I'm visualizing, and I'm sending this energy, and it's got to be very real in my brain, right? So the clarity of what's happening is important. It's a part of defining what's going on. And these are easy. Stability. Can you maintain the state? If you can't, you're unstable. What do we expect? Novices are going to be what? Less stable than experts. And then how hard is it to do it? So some novices are really good at maintaining a meditative state or instructions, but it takes a lot of effort. And so answering these questions might be a good way of starting to prescribe mindfulness in a way that's more individualized, for example, for like a musician. So the study is, I wanted to find out what meditative experience, what's the relationship between meditative experience and science. This is the neurophenomenological question. These experiences tie to what networks exactly? What can I learn about music students specifically, and what can I do with this matrix later? Is this useful just outside a research context? These weren't my research questions, but I'm bored by my research questions. 18 students self-selected to a mindfulness module. This was part of a class. I wanted to be ecologically valid. Basically what we did is it was a freshman orientation class for people who want to be music teachers, and there was a wellness unit, and we said, hey, you can do this mindfulness thing for 5 days and it's self-guided, or you can do this other thing, which was a time that they were able to, they measured how much time they spent on particular activities each day and compared it to what their desired use of time was, right? There were 40-something in this group, 18 selected. I pulled myself out of the protocol. It was not graded. It was done by a graduate student. I didn't know who did it. I only got the data afterwards when the students were done, they had got their grades. So I try to mediate the fact that I didn't want them to just report something because I told them so. Is that actually what happened? Probably not. There's probably students in there who are like, maybe Mr. Diaz will read this and really love me if I tell him mindfulness was good. The way I counteract that is that I had at least 2 students that said this was garbage. Right, so there were 2 that were like, nope, not for me, right? So there was some variety there. They did 5 days. They did body scan meditations, guided body scan meditations, and they had open-ended prompts. I didn't want to feed them what these invariants were. I just want to see if they actually emerged from their experiences. Do they talk about object orientation? Do they talk about meta? Are these things, is this model viable? And so I'll tell you a little bit about the body scan meditations. We started with 5-minute ones for 2 days. Then they did a 20-minute one, and then they did 3 20-minute ones. So I wanted to see what happens when you boost the amount of time that they have to an experience meditation. Does that change your experience? We took data over 5 days. These were self-report. They had to do it, they did it online on a journal. One question I get asked is, how do you know they actually did it? They don't. I think that's something you have to address later. We have to find a way of making sure that when people do these protocols, they're actually doing the protocols. Now, why did I not intervene? Because it was ecologically valid. This is essentially what people would do if you were giving them an app. So I wanted to find out, at least from that perspective, without controlling too much, what might happen if I taught people meditation through some guided meditation things. Okay, so yeah, 5, 1 per day, 20 minutes, 1 per day. What did these do? They asked, the object orientation was sensations to various locations in their body. Anybody here ever done a body scan? I'm just curious. Yeah, so you move your attention around, right? You maintain meta-awareness, you can de-reify. So they notice that's meta-awareness, and they maintain the non-judgmental attitude towards distraction. So one of the things that is also common among all meditative or mindfulness practices is what we call non-aversive affect. In other words, you're supposed to maintain a state of curiosity or a state of non-judgment as you do this, which can be very difficult to do. And I classify this as focused awareness because at no point did they open the aperture up to everything. They kept moving from, for example, notice the sensation of breath coming into your nose, notice your body, notice all this stuff. So, it's very focused on this particular type of practice with 2 dosages. This is where it gets crazy because I'm not a qualitative researcher or phenomenologist. So I had to find 2 people who were experts in phenomenological reduction who were willing to look at this data and triangulate with me. So if you've ever done qualitative research, which is, I think, beautiful but incredibly difficult to do, you get people in a room and they code, and then they code again, and then they code again, and eventually they try to find some level of agreement. I was not trained to do this. So one of my co-authors was a phenomenologist who was amenable to but somewhat skeptical of meditative practice. And then my third person was a buddy of mine who just thinks this is all bunk. So I brought those 3 in. We gathered the data and we started an iterative process. I basically taught them the matrix. I called John Dunn, who was one of the folks who developed this matrix. I conferred with Cliff Sarin. I wanted to make sure I understood the matrix correctly. We gave him that data, had him code it. We came back, and what we found out was there was some disagreement. So then we fixed it. We said, okay, how about this? How about this? Maybe this is what we mean. We sent it back, and over time, we went to a point where we found some agreement, right? So this is the iterative process. So we used deductive analysis, and we wanted to see if these matrix categories were actually emerging in the data. We also had an open code. We wanted to find out if other stuff emerged, other stuff that emerged, particularly the sense of embodiment that was so critical to these meditation practices, which is not captured in this model. Okay, and then we had to figure out, do these actually relate to anything in the cognitive and neuroscientific literature? Raoul told me this picture was up just 2 months ago. Here it is again. This is the phenomenological matrix of mindfulness, which uses a Euclidean space to sort of map out all of these different types of experiences, right? These phenomenal invariants, so here's the meta-awareness dimension, object orientation, de-reification, effort, stability, clarity, and aperture. And what they're showing here is what a particular, I believe this is an expert doing focused attention meditation should display these qualities, right? Focused attention for a novice, as you notice here, that dark blue means that effort would be a lot higher, right? You look at de-reification, it involved quite a bit more de-reification in order for them to maintain that state. Oh, sorry. And so you're seeing basically what potential mappings, these are all theoretical, we actually don't know if this is what people would experience. But why this matters is, if we can actually map these things out, we can start to figure out, okay, what is it that a person experiences as a novice when they're doing focused attention meditation that differentiates them from an expert, right? Because what we have right now is a lot of expert data or little inductions, 15-minute inductions, and we actually don't know what's going on, at least not with some depth, with respect to the differences in these. So when Cliff first introduced this to me, I was really confused. And it took me a long time to try to understand what was going on. Maybe you're brighter than me and you can figure it out intuitively, but I'm going to skip over this for a little bit because it is kind of not immediately intuitive, but it's just a way of showing what the model looks like in three-dimensional space. So everything is active. What they're saying here is that at no point, these are all things that are going on in a sort of bottleneck of cognition, and that some of it is reportable. That's what they're essentially mapping here. All right, let's find out what students actually said about their axiological context. In other words, why do I want to do this? So I want to get through just a few of these. We kind of quoted them. We found out that students felt a sense of overwhelm. They had judgmental thoughts about themselves, judgmental thoughts about others, and a sort of generalized sense of anxiety. And these are examples that we pulled out of the journals, of the self-report that related to these themes. So this person gets stressed out when they have a lot on their plate. They're terrible at managing their life. And I want to get better at finding ways not to be stressed. This person really has a lot of academic-based anxiety and performance-based anxiety, and I often become my own worst critic. And as soon as I miss a note or play something different, I intend my mind lingers on this moment in general. Neurophenomenology might tell us there are different networks involved in this, and which ones do we want to target, right? That's sort of what we think might happen. I often feel overwhelmed by fear of judgments, and then here is I suffer from overall anxiety, right? So we wanted to look at where they started, look at their experiences, and then at the end do an appraisal of what's going on and relate it to potential neurocorrelates that might be studied in conjunction with a study like this. Oh, check it out. I want to focus better. I want to be better with my peers and my parents and my church members. I mean, so here's a great example. What if I gave this person a focused attention practice? I'm not entirely sure how that might help with that. It could. There's maybe something going on, but I'm not entirely sure. They might say, now that I focus better, I have better relationships with my parents. Well, not if you're focusing on how much they annoy you, right? So we can't get past the experience here in terms of adding depth and richness to this. Very quickly, we did find every single category emerged. Okay, yeah, we found every category emerged. So yay, the model worked. Here's all of it. We found object orientation, and we found that we had about a 78% agreement on the statements that included object orientation. De-reification, they all emerged in the data. We had agreement, very good agreement overall for our first time. And then we sort of just created little statements here. What we found in the state reports after meditation that related to these. Now I want to be clear that in these, there are more than one dimension found in each one of these statements. What we were trying to do is show statements that were very close to the dimension. It was sort of centered on that particular dimension of experience. But this is not to say that you only experience clarity. You talk about all the different things that are going on. So here's sensitivity. What were people able to report? If we're going to talk about designing a good measure, people are really good at telling you what object they're attending to. We do this in everyday life. People are really good at noticing when they're distracted, actually. They report quite a bit on feelings of distraction. So this is an overall average of statements related to this throughout the entire 5-day period. Oh yeah, I noticed my mind going away and I brought it back. They could report a little bit on aperture, that didn't seem to interest them. Effort, of course. Other was a lot of embodiment and breathing type stuff that they talked about. Look at what they were really bad at. This is F2, this is de-reification. Folks don't understand the concept of de-reification in a sort of novice setting. What does that mean? What do you mean I have to let go of thoughts? What does that mean that I let go of thoughts? Aren't I my thoughts? So this was a very difficult thing, and it gives us an insight of what kinds of training might be really important if we're going to see some changes. But again, this is quantitative, right? I mean, we have some quantitative data. We can look at this in a sort of abstract way. This is a confusing graph, but I'll point to this. Anybody want to guess what this dimension was? This is the number of statements having to do with what dimension by the 3rd day? Effort. So, no surprise, 5 minutes? Oh, this is great. Okay, it's getting a little hard. Holy crap! Back down, and then they adjusted. So as time went on, this feeling of having to work too hard actually went away. Then there's other dimensions here, so we tracked them over time. Were they in state? In other words, were they actually overall in the meditative state? What we found is that the first day, we're kind of here in terms of statements, and then it kind of really diverged. The 3rd day, people couldn't maintain a state. And then we kind of ended at 5 days. You see sort of like this, not applicable with stuff that has nothing to do with the meditative state. They were just reporting on like kitty cats. And this one up here is they were in focused attention. And then here they were in some other state like rumination or something like that. So we kind of see a graph of whether people can maintain a meditative state over a few days. All right, here's where it gets really controversial. And I'm out of my lane here a little bit, but I did include this. So what I started to do is I started to think about, okay, so if a person is reporting object orientation improvements over 5 days, where might we see that? What evidence do we have of something similar to that? And this is not just mine, this comes from Saren's work and a few other research and some of my own. We might see that there is more activation in the central executive network and perhaps some deactivation in the default mode network. These are putative, we don't know, but that might be a place to look for something like increased ability to orient to an object. A psychological outcome might be the ability to retain goal-oriented behavior, less mind wandering and distraction. And then here's a statement that we felt kind of centered on object orientation. I noticed drastic differences in my focus and awareness for extended periods of time after each mindfulness meditation session. I especially found myself finding it easier to focus on studying and doing traditional schoolwork. That's important data. I'm not sure you can get that data from just taking a psychometric. This is data that's what contextualized into the everyday life of a musician. What's missing here, of course, is that I would like to pair up with somebody who understands how to take measures like this and say, okay, was there any change in this? Are we looking in the right place? Is the central executive network the right place to look at? Or is this in combination with other networks? What are we doing? How does this look like in the brain? Again, that's out of my lane. Theoreification, letting go. We should see some deactivation of DMN. Specifically the posterior cingulate cortex and stronger coupling between the PCC and regions of the DMN. We found that in the literature. Meta-awareness may be the activation of the salience network and certain subcomponents of the central executive network. Here's what we think these statements might be alluding to. And then we go on and on and on, and I don't want to get through all of these, but basically they're all hypotheses. Now that we have an experience, do we find something that accords in the psychological literature and potentially in the neuroscience literature? How can we make some mutual constraints between these two? What did we find out? People naive to mindfulness reported expectations of improvements to focus, emotional well-being, relationships, and self-development. Okay, so that's important. I know why they're doing it. And what they did is they contextualized any change. So they would never say, I focus better. They would say, I focus better and it's helping me do this, which is much different than I can just generally focus better. We did find that every dimension of the matrix, we found that in the literature. It could be math, and we did find that perhaps there might be some cross-disciplinary aspects of it that accord to scientific and cognitive constructs and measurements. And finally, from a more practical perspective, I now teach a class at the Jacob School. It's mindfulness in teaching and wellness and performance. And about 56 students enrolled in that class, and we have started doing this year is that we teach them different practices each week. They do the practice. We use this model to pace the class, so we decided not to throw 20-minute body scans the first week. They do 5 minutes, 5 minutes. They use pre-existing measures to report, so we have some quantitative data. And then we're testing other more open-ended measures that look at perhaps some psychometric qualities of those dimensions that we might use to create new measures that account for this data a little bit differently. And so we're doing that throughout the class. It's great. I'll have 15 weeks of 56 participants, which is fantastic. It's noticing their changes overall with respect to practices. The final part of that is how might I use this to actually help my students use mindfulness in a way that's meaningful to them. The applications here for sports psychology, I think, are pretty clear. I think athletes don't all suffer from the same thing. They suffer from different types of cognitive distortions, body things, exhaustion, all of these different facets of that get in the way of their performance. And when we're prescribing mindfulness to them, we could be more targeted if we understood better what it is that we are targeting and how they experience it. You all stayed awake, thank you. That's all I got. Thanks so much for coming. I drink a little bit of water. They've been running me. Answer. Yeah.
Should we look at all about how musicians perceive the music or what they were playing, or how they listen to music differently?
We tried not to give them any prompts, but we wanted to just find out, did this change, right? And I didn't show some of the reports in there, but yeah, a handful of them said my practice got better. So I was able to concentrate more on the targets of what I wanted to practice. In other words, I'm practicing tone in my scale, so now I can do that better. I don't think in 5 days, there was one person that said, I just had a performance, and for the first time in my life, I noticed that my body was like freaking out, and I was able to notice it, and it went away by just noticing it. So we found that to be an interesting find. But again, it's one person, right? So how well this generalizes to other people, we don't know, but at least we started with that. But yeah, they contextualize it themselves, which is what we were hoping they would do, by simply prompting them to tell us about your experiences. Tell us about what happened during meditation and what happens after meditation. And then we compare those to their actual objectives. And here's an interesting finding that we didn't report. In general, they judged what happened at the end in comparison to their objectives. So in other words, if they had mindfulness and they were targeting something else and they didn't experience it, they said, this was not a good practice for me, which I think is really relevant so that we don't just prescribe anything. Yes?
I'm curious about how you imagine the phenomenal invariance actually being measurable in neuroscience. I just mean because if everyone is experiencing it so differently,
Yeah.
how to actually capture that and maybe what method would even be useful
Yes.
to look at. Because if one person is experiencing increased DMN or decreased DMN, you may actually get washing out of a lot of these different constructs.
Yeah, that's I don't know the answer to that. But I want to clarify what phenomenal invariants are. So phenomenal invariants, at least the way I understand it from Varela's perspective, are not, they're processes that I can report to that we can all share. So for example, attention, awareness. Those are not the things, they're the processes behind the thing. So we have to train people to do that and report on it. We believe meditators have an incredibly refined sense of being able to report this stuff. And a lot of the studies, sort of expert meditators are indeed seeing changes to these networks based on these reports, and there's a little bit of consistency. So that's expert meditators, right? What can we expect from a novice meditator? These are open questions, but I think it will help us stop saying things like meditation shuts down the default mode network, which is a common, it might, right? But actually, what if I don't want my default mode network shut down because it actually is the basis of my creativity? Right? And I've had people come up, well, won't this make you not be creative? And I said, yeah, I imagine that if there's some relationship between creativity and selfing and memory and creation or whatever, the default mode network, if I shut that down, right? So then that helps us answer that question a little bit more. And I think this is why it takes neuroscientists to sit in a room with phenomenologists and philosophers and people and say, okay, wait, is that a good question? And what can we actually measure? But I do think you can get behind the lived experience to the processes that are going on that do happen. So we do know what attention basically looks like in the brain. We do know what top-down and bottom-up attention looks like. We can look at it at the level of neural integration. We can look at it at EEG. There are definitely biocorrelates there that we can find. They're not all consistent, as you well know, but we might be able to say, well, this person's reporting heightened attention. This is a good way to say it, but it will never get to the issue. You're right. What Varela said is you will never be able to reduce experience in context to this, but that doesn't mean you don't look at it. It just means they help mutually constrain each other so that we ask more meaningful questions. So it doesn't solve the hard problem of experience, but I think it gets around it in a sort of pragmatic way. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yes?
How might you teach or train a novice to get better at de-reification and understand what it is?
Yeah. So I don't use the term de-reification as the first part. I've been teaching meditation for I think 10 or 15 years and in all sorts of populations. So this is something I struggle with all the time. I think the way that I teach it, first of all, is I use the strawberry experiment. So I'll explain what that is. I have people imagine a strawberry. I should have done it with you, but now you know the joke. And I have them imagine it, and they pick it up, and then I have them put it in their mouth, and then I ask them to raise their hands when they salivated. And they're like, oh, I'm salivating. And I'll say, well, where's the strawberry? And they're like, well, there's no strawberry. I said, yeah. So like reifying a strawberry in your mind is not dangerous, but it might be dangerous if you're reifying a thought about the past that is very traumatic for you, that you keep spinning over and over and over again. So I relate it to the ability for the mind, not the brain, because I'm not sure what's happening in the brain. I relate it to the ability of the mind to get stuck on something to the point that you believe it is real and you're fused with it. And so I'll use things like, I'll use strategies like, for example, simple strategies like meta-awareness. When you notice that you are distracted, come back to an object. So that might de-reify. If that doesn't work, I might say another strategy is to just label, say, just a thought. Right? This is pretty standard MBSR protocol. It's not anything I came up with. I might say, when thoughts arise, imagine them as clouds in your experience that take form and dissipate and aren't permanent objects. So we can use labeling tools, we can use imagination tools, we can just simply have them notice. And then I think there's a point where rumination is so pathological that mindfulness should not be used. And that's another, so at some point, if a person cannot let go of a thought and mindfulness is actually making it worse because their meta-awareness is increased, that's not my job to teach them that. I think at that point, we have to be smart enough to say, go to a therapist. This is outside my lane. And I fear that we don't do that very well when we start playing with these tools. So that's how I teach it. It seems to work pretty well for most people. But again, that's anecdote, right? It's not data.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Sure.
So you said 10 to 15 years of teaching meditation. What kind of work have you done with children?
Yeah, so I'm a public school teacher. I was for 10 years, so I did quite a bit of work with children as a teacher myself. At the time that I was doing that work, I did not have the scientific background or even really the training to do it. I just had been a long time. I started meditating when I was 12 and became a serious practitioner at 18. So I've been practicing different types of meditation for over 25 years. And I started using it as a teacher, incorporating it into what they were already doing in the classroom. So I would turn, as a musician, I would turn a breathing practice into a focused awareness practice. I did call it meditation. And then just sort of noted what happened. And actually, that's why I went back to grad school, because I did anecdotally notice my students experiencing life differently, but I couldn't come up with a scientific reason why that might be happening.
So what method did you find most effective for children and for a particular outcome?
Boy, that's a really complicated question. If I had an answer to that, I'd give it to you. I would say this. For young children, anchoring attention is really important. It needs to be sensory. So the more sensory it is, the more they can touch and feel and connect to something physical that has stability, the easier it is to teach focused awareness.
Young children meaning?
I have a 7-year-old, for example, and I've been teaching her mindfulness since she was 4. And if I do a breathing, I don't say notice your breathing, I say notice how your belly rises up and down when you put your hand on it. So it's very sensory. I think that's one distinction. I also think the interventions need to be much shorter when you're a kid. So 1 minute of something incorporated into your everyday experience is really important. So what affects what? I think that's an open question. And that's actually my issue with what's going on in education, is that we're saying all these outcomes are happening, but we're not really understanding what it is that we did that may have caused those outcomes. It could simply be something as simple as what? Your teacher is different now, and now you're reacting differently, which we actually find in research. And teachers who do meditative practice, there's less behavior problems, and we think, oh, it's the meditation that did it. No, the students are all of a sudden relating to their teacher differently because their relationship is different, right? So it wasn't anything that they taught necessarily. So I think these are open questions. I do teach teachers to do this, and we're in the experimental stage, I sort of take the Hippocratic oath, like don't harm them, and make sure that you know when the harm is happening. But you can experiment in a lot of different ways of doing this. Oh, sorry. That answers your question. Hi.
Hi, how's it going?
Good, how are you?
I'm great, thanks. I teach music technology.
Yeah.
And have had kind of an interest in working with different frequencies
Yeah.
and using sound for brain entrainment methodologies,
Yes.
Which is another thing that's been studied in neuroscience.
Yeah.
And it's hard to quantify what exactly is happening with the sound waves, but I think it poses a question about, can sound be used as a tool for mindfulness, and even in structuring like a critical listening exercise to get
Yep.
people to pay closer attention to what they are perceiving in music,
Yep.
rather than being secondary to their daily activities.
Yes, the answer is yes. Right? So object orientation does not tell you what object to orient to.
Right.
So sound is an object in your mind, right? It has a sensory component, it has a vibratory component. With my musicians, one thing I'll say is if you can't concentrate on your breath, turn on a tuner or turn on a sound wave and use that as your object of meditation. And they actually find that very easier in some ways. The other stuff you're talking about, I think I do mindful listening as well, where we just say, can you suspend judgment and just report on what's going on and how does it come up in your body? So we even do it, I might play something for them. I say, well, notice what you feel in your body when you hear that. What do you mean? I'm supposed to feel something in my body when I listen to music? Yeah. Now talk about the associations. So let's look at the mental landscape. Let's look at the associations between these two. And so I think it can be done actually with musicians. I do that quite a bit. And tonight, Richard will talk quite a bit. He comes at it from that angle. Music as mindfulness, which I think, again, if you look at just those phenomenal invariants, musicians focus on an object, let go, and have meta-awareness when they play and listen. So what's the difference between mindfulness and listening to music? The context. The axiological and context of what am I trying to get out of this? How am I framing this experience? Which I believe personally you can't remove from the human experience. I think it's part of what makes us human beings, is that we make meaning out of stuff. So I think you can use these tools in a class to build deep listening in the musicians and in performers. And some people do this without calling it mindfulness. Paul Oliveira's work, and it's out there. It's just this is how we're conceptualizing of it now. That's really cool. You're still here. I only have like 2 more minutes with Catherine praised. Are we done now? Is this?
Maybe so.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you so much for coming tonight.